Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's lecture in which we'll be wrapping up all of this great stuff we've been learning about with the French Revolution, and we're really going to hone in. We're going to cover a lot of years of history here. We're going to wrap this all up. We're going to do that by asking the question, what actually changed when we think about France from before the French Revolution? That was represented by that game we played in class last block day. What changed by the time the revolution was all said and done? That's what we hope to focus in on here today, so come along. First off, let's just review. Maybe you missed a day, maybe something didn't quite click with you. Let's go through the story so far. You remember, as I said on last block day, we played the game, Can You Avoid the French Revolution? And you were introduced to the three different estates. There's obviously the king, but then the king has to deal with the first estate, the church, the second estate, the nobles, and the third estate, everybody else. And the whole reason the French Revolution happened was really because the amount of power that each of these different players had was severely imbalanced. So anyways, France goes bankrupt in 1789. They completely run out of money. And so the king calls this meeting called the Estates General. That's when all the three estates meet together and everybody gets a say. The third estate, they decide to go off into their own room and say, we are France. The nobles, the church, they're such a small little part of France. We really are France. And so the third estate ends up claiming most power for themselves. Now, they're really inspired by those thinkers of liberalism we studied even earlier last week. John Locke, you saw how John Locke's ideas show up in some of their writings, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this idea of the general will and of a real true democracy that represents the people. The third estate is really fired up and inspired by these guys. So what happens next? Well, the second estate is really desperate to keep their power, to keep their wealth. And so they sort of come up with this compromise with the third estate, where they say, we're going to write a constitution. We're going to keep the monarchy sort of as a figurehead. And how we're going to pay off the debt is we are going to stab the churches back. And the first estate, the church, they're the big losers in the French Revolution. We decide to take all their land and sell it off. And that is how that debt is paid off. The second and the third estates are happy. And it seems for the time like the king is happy as well. But it comes, as you found out yesterday in the escape room, that King Louis XVI was actually not a supporter of this revolution at all. He was working behind the back of the revolutionaries and eventually even tried to escape France. So he was found guilty of treason for not supporting the revolution. And as more than half of you voted to do, he was executed for this crime. Now, something else happens right around the same time, and that's that the French Revolution, the French national anthem is written within just a few months of all of this stuff happening. Now, I've included a link so you can listen to it later. The French national anthem has got to be one of my favorites, but the lyrics, for lack of a better word, are just so metal. And they would have been singing this song as they led King Louis XVI up to get his head chopped off. The same song that's the French national anthem today. Grab your weapons, citizens. Form your battalions. Let us march. Let us march. May impure blood water our fields. And imagine that everybody there gathered in Paris, and they are excited because what an execution is about to happen. As you might guess, this kicks off a very dark phase in the French Revolution. This is where things are going to take a turn, and we're going to go from trying to live up to those ideals of liberalism, like equality and freedom and democracy, and we're going to start going down a much darker path. And this all starts with the first phase. We're going to talk about three phases of the end of the French Revolution today, the Reign of Terror. My recommendation is that you get these three phases into your notes, that you know what these periods of time are, what years they covered, and what the major events were, maybe who the major people were. So your goal is to take notes to really understand, okay, I've looked at the French Revolution so far. I know the causes. I know those early stages up until King Louis XVI's trial. What happens next? We're going to break that down into your notes in three separate phases, starting, of course, first with the Reign of Terror from 1793 to 1794. So we really need to back up. This actually happened even before the trial of King Louis XVI, and it's an event known as the Battle of Valmy. I've marked there on the map where the town of Valmy is in France. And this is a battle that takes place in 1792. Now, Prussia, you'll later know them as part of the groups of people that will unify to form Germany. They decide to invade because they're not so thrilled about all this French Revolution stuff. And the Prussians actually have more than 80,000 troops in combination with the Austrians, and they're not scared of the French at all. So they just send a small forward force of about 34,000. Now, the French defense there is 36,000 fighters. So it's a pretty even matchup there, and they're being invaded. They have to defend themselves. There's a real chance that this army wants to march on Paris and just shut the revolution down. What happens? Well, before we know that, we should recognize that it's not just 36,000 French troops or French soldiers. It's actually about half of that is soldiers, half of that is untrained volunteers, village people who have taken up whatever guns they can find to try to fight off the Prussians. They're untrained, they're purely volunteers, they aren't paid at all. And guess what? They win. This is one of the big turning points, just like we saw with King Louis XVI. Another one of the biggest turning points, I would argue, is right here, where in 1792, the Prussians are invading, and a French fighting force, half of which are not even soldiers, actually manage to defend France. Because just like when King Louis XVI is tried very quickly after this, it gives so much boldness now to regular people, to the common man. You remember what France was like prior to the French Revolution. The common person had no power at all. And now a series of events have really empowered them, right? They've been able to fight off one of the finest military forces in the world. And as you know, they will eventually put the king on trial. So what did happen next after this? Well, let's go through the sort of cycle I'm talking about here. As we said last block day, France before the revolution looked like this. Who had all the power? The king and the church had a lot of power. The people had almost nothing. And the nobles were somewhere in the middle. Sometimes they'd be a little bit on the losing side, but if they teamed up with the king and were successful, they could get a lot of power back. Now, once the revolution started, this really all evened out. As we said, we go to a constitutional monarchy. The people and the king are put on an even playing field. And again, it's kind of the nobles caught in the middle. They're keeping the peace. That's really what we saw. You might recognize when we read the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The people are rioting, the king's life is in danger, and the nobles step in and they sort of create this document that is reminiscent of the American Revolution and makes everyone happy. So the nobles are caught in the middle, but during the early stages of the revolution, there's a lot of shared power. But after the Battle of Valmy, what happens? Well, the people are going to seize so much power for themselves. The people are going to realize we don't need a king, but we don't need the nobles either. And notice the church is nowhere to even be found on these latter two little diagrams here. The people, the regular people of France, are going to take so much power for themselves. And this is going to lead to some great changes, but it's going to lead to some negative changes as well. You'll see what I mean. For starters, after the Battle of Valmy, within a few years, some of France's greatest minds decide to create a new calendar. And they consider the Battle of Valmy now year one. They start everything over. And they want to base their calendar entirely on rationality and science. So instead of having 12 months, they have 10 months. And those 10 months have 10 weeks with 10 days, and the days have 10 hours, and it's all base 10, and it adds up nicely, and it's based on math and science. They name the months after whatever the temperature is in that month, naming them things like hot or cold or windy month. They form a new religion in the same vein. It's called the Cult of Reason. And in this religion, they don't worship a god. It's actually an official atheistic religion in which they worship science and the human mind. And most importantly of all, not only do they get a new calendar, not only do they get a new official religion, they get a new tool, which is called the guillotine. If there's one word that represents the reign of terror, it is guillotine. Now you can see the guillotine over there on the far right. It was an invention made to quickly and painlessly kill people. It's an execution machine. And what it is it's very tall, and there's a very heavy blade, and you insert someone's head, and then you drop the blade from a high height, and it instantly will sever their head. Pretty gruesome, but remember, the idea is that it was meant to be painless. It was meant to be quick. It was meant to be, as we'll see, efficient. And the challenge with that is, well, maybe it was a little bit too good at its job. You'll see what I mean. The first major victim of the guillotine is, of course, King Louis XVI, who now we're only a few months after the Battle of Valmy, just 1 month after King Louis's trial. What happens? Well, in January 1793, King Louis XVI heads to the guillotine and his head is chopped off. Shortly after, later that year, Marie Antoinette, his lovely wife, she's been rotting in prison along with her son in King Louis XVI's absence. And by October, the people have had about enough and they send her to the guillotine. Right around the same time, the folks that are in power in France, they get a little bit bold with this. They realize, wait, that was pretty effective. We used to have to worry about this king and now we don't. They pass a law in September 1793. It's called the Law of Suspects. And here's what that law states. It says anyone can be arrested, and eventually in a few months they'll amend it to be killed if they are suspected to be working against the French Revolution. That's the Law of Suspects. Why did things get so extreme? Well, remember, at this point, the people have taken a lot of power for themselves. The king, who seemed to be a symbol of France, is found to be working against the French Revolution. And what is clear is that the people at this time, led in particular by a few particularly nasty folks, are feeling very bold and feeling that if the French Revolution gets toppled, if the French Revolution fails, if they're conquered by an outside force or there's some sort of overthrow of the government from within, all of the things they've worked for will collapse. And so the decision is made that if people are suspected to be working against the French Revolution, we need to put a stop to that very quickly. And right at the same time, as we mentioned, the guillotine makes for a very good tool for doing that. Now, I want to go to one of the key figures here in the French Revolution, and that is Maximilian Robespierre. Maximilian Robespierre, if the guillotine is the symbol people think of when they think of the Reign of Terror, Robespierre is probably the person that people think of when they think of the Reign of Terror. And, Robespierre was a pretty well-educated man. He really kind of comes more from the Second Estate background, but he ultimately runs at the Estates General to represent the Third Estate, to represent the common folks. And he was well-educated, and like many well-educated folks at the time, he originally was against the death penalty. But then when King Louis's trial came around, something changed, and he said this: "The sentiment that led me to call for the abolition of the death penalty is the same that today forces me to demand that it be applied to the tyrant of my country." In other words, you remember those ideals of liberalism, freedom, equality, democracy? Robespierre is saying that in normal circumstances, fighting for freedom, fighting for equality, fighting for democracy, that would mean fighting against the death penalty. But in extraordinary circumstances, like the French Revolution, you might need to chop some heads in order to secure freedom and equality in democracy. And this is where we'll see Robespierre and those around him will become very out of hand very quickly. Now, how out of hand do they get? Well, by early July in 1794, so we're talking just about 8 or 9 months after the death of Marie Antoinette, more than 16,000 people have been killed. 16,000 people by early July. And eventually, later that month, this will get so out of hand that eventually Robespierre will be a suspect of someone working against the French Revolution, and his head will get chopped off. Maybe you saw that that's where this was going. The point is what? The machine of the guillotine, the machine of French Revolution politics has gotten so out of hand by this point that really nobody is safe. Imagine that 16,000 people have been killed. That means that at the peak of the Reign of Terror, this period of time between 1793 and 1794, approximately 30 people in Paris were being executed every day. Imagine what it would have been like to be a common person during the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror. You were probably in one of 3 categories. Maybe you were someone who was in politics. Well, then chances are you were, if you said the wrong thing, getting your head chopped off. Or maybe you were just a normal person trying to stay out of it. Well, unfortunately, most of the normal people just egged this on. The public executions became a big spectacle. You could buy tickets that had pamphlets saying who were the people due to be executed today. It was a whole big show. Or maybe you're someone not living in Paris at all, you're living in the countryside, and your goal really would have been to just stay out of it and try to just keep doing your thing in the countryside and not to go anywhere near Paris, because we all know that is pretty crazy. 30 people per day. So thinking about all of this, we're going to pause the video now in just a second. I want you to wrap up this section on the Reign of Terror in your notes by answering two big questions. First of all, when we think about the Reign of Terror compared to that game we played last block day, compared to the Ancien Regime, life before the French Revolution, what has changed and what is the same? I want you to see if you can get at least a sentence for both. Let's go ahead and pause the video, and then we'll pick it up once you've had a chance to write. I hope you were able to write something good. We're moving on to the next major section, the next major phase of the revolution, and it's a fairly long one. We call it the Directory. It's going to last from 1795 all the way through 1799. So what happened next? As we know, this machine of French Revolution politics has just chewed up and spit people out, eventually leading even to the ringleader, Maximilian Robespierre, having his head chopped off too. No one is safe in French Revolution politics. And at this point, there's a real desire, after a year of this, from the people of Paris and the politicians of Paris who have managed to survive, to settle things down. And there's sort of a memory, faint memory in their mind. All the way back in 1792, the people of France had voted to set up this thing called the National Convention. And their sole purpose was supposed to be to create a constitution, a new constitution without a king. Remember that 1792 was right around the time King Louis went on trial. But because of this Reign of Terror business, it was now 1795, 3 years later, and that body still had not made a constitution. The governing system was basically killing the enemies of the government and nothing more than that. So it was time to create a new system. What did they come up with? Well, they came up with a Congress that actually looks a lot like the United States Congress. It has an upper house and a lower house, and it has a president. Well, not exactly one president. It has a system called the Directory of 5 presidents. And these presidents all are supposed to work together, and it's supposed to be better than just having one. But as you can see by the picture I've chosen, that's not exactly how things shake out. Let me tell you what I mean. First of all, right around this time, late 1795, we head into an intensely cold winter, 1794 and 1795, actually. And so what happens is that France suffers massive food shortages. And this leads to some problems. Most notably, the regular people of Paris are saying, wait a second, we've got this new government, but they can't feed us. At least back in the day when public executions were happening 30 times a day, sure, that was bad, but we were getting fed. Maybe this new system isn't so great. So these 5 presidents come into office, and already the public is skeptical of them. It doesn't help that that group that led the Reign of Terror, the group under Maximilian Robespierre, who were called the Jacobins, they're going to continually try to revive that. They're going to stoke the population and say, hey, maybe things weren't so bad in the old system. And they're going to continually be a pest. Eventually, 2 Jacobins will actually get elected to be 2 of the 5 presidents, and that'll cause a lot of problems. Now, on the other side, not only do we have the Jacobins that want, mob rule and, violence in the streets and the guillotine for political enemies, you also have some pro-monarchy rebels on the other side. You have people who said this all has been crazy for like 3 years. Can't we get a king back in action? King Louis XVII, his kid is still like sitting in prison dying. Can we bring him back in and try to make things stable? And so some of those rebels start taking action. They actually raid the convention a few times. And maybe most interesting of all, that war, which it really focused, which was really very central earlier in the revolution with all of those different countries of Europe, is still going on. And at this point, Great Britain in 1795 has really joined the fray. And if you know anything about Great Britain at this time, you know that they're probably the biggest naval power in the world. So now we've got Great Britain's Navy, Prussia, Austria, all these other countries are still on the attack. And these 5 presidents are just going to kind of scratch their head and be a little bit clueless for a while. And from 1795 to 1799, France does not have good governance. In fact, pretty much all France is doing in this time period is battling anyone who will go to war with them. Take a look at this map I've created for you here. Any trends you notice? Well, if you're looking carefully, you'll notice that France is winning about as many battles as they're losing. Every year they win a couple, they lose a couple. They do the same thing next year. But look where they're fighting. They're fighting in Spain, in Great Britain, in Ireland, in the Netherlands, in Austria, in Italy. They're fighting off of the coast of the United States. The proxy war, this is the first real war the United States ever gets into against French revolutionary forces. And over in Egypt, some of France's forces make it as far as Egypt, where they're engaging in naval battles on the Nile River with British ships. So what is the only trend here? France is fighting with anyone who will fight back. Why are they doing that? What's the idea? Well, I think the strategy is something like this. Do you remember what rallied the French people to begin with? Do you remember what really got the French people going enough to get rid of the monarchy? It was that military victory back at Valmy. And the truth is, when news would come back of a French military victory, all of those defeats would be forgotten. And what would be remembered is French pride and French nationalism and a desire to keep this new country. They would have seen it as a new country in the midst of revolution going. So what happens during this time period? Well, I want to talk about the currency. One way to think about how would the average person's life have really played out in this time period. One of the currencies that was created during the French Revolution was the assignat. And the assignat was created actually as a currency to buy off the land from the church. You remember they sold all the First Estates land. And by 1796, just 1 year into the Directory, that currency had dropped to less than 1% of its original value. In other words, if you're a regular person who maybe you were promised that, hey, now that the revolution has come around, you're going to have more wealth. Well, that money that you would have gotten at the beginning of the revolution was now worth 1% of what it was originally. It couldn't even buy you bread at this point. And so this is really important because remember, what caused the French Revolution in the first place? Well, it was that France had run out of money. And now, sure, we've chopped the head off the king, we've created a new constitution, but fundamentally, we're in the exact same place. France is out of money. So let's pause it there for a moment and let's wrap up this second phase about the Directory with the same question. Think back to before the French Revolution. Think back to that game we played about the Ancien Regime, the three estates. Compared to that period of time, what has changed and what is the same? Again, I want you to see, can you get at least one sentence on each of those topics? Pause the video, take some time to write. Did you get something? I hope you did, because that means it is time to go into the final phase of the French Revolution. And we are going to call that the Napoleonic Empire. This really starts at the end of the Directory at 1799, as you'll see, and it'll go on until about 1815. It'll pick up again in the 1830s and the 1850s. And what you're going to see is that really the French Revolution ends in 1799. But France is not really going to have a system of government that's stable, that gives the people power until like the 1880s. In other words, the French Revolution is ending for our story, but you should know it's also just beginning. You should see what I mean here in a minute. And to start, we need to talk about a very particular word, and that word is coup, not coup or caup. The word is coup. What is a coup? Well, a coup is an attempt to overthrow the government outside of the way that the government is supposed to work. So for example, in our country, can we change who's in charge? Can we change the leaders? Absolutely, through elections. But if we try to change the leaders or change the system not using elections, for instance, using military force or something else, that is a coup. The idea is that in a stable country, you should not have coups. Coups are a bad thing. Guess what's going to happen here to the Directory? Now, one thing to note about a coup is that a coup usually requires a very popular leader to work. Here's a big lesson from history. Are people willing to give up their say? Are people willing to give up democracy? Are people willing to give up these ideals of liberalism like equality and freedom? In fact, history teaches us that they are, if a popular leader can convince them to. And that popular leader we need to meet is named Napoleon Bonaparte. Here's a person that I'm sure you've heard of throughout history, but who actually was he? He's the popular leader, but where does he come from? Why does he come in at this moment of French history? And what should we know about him? We should know that Napoleon Bonaparte was born an insignificant member of the nobility. In other words, he's one of the lower rungs of the second estate at the beginning of the French Revolution. And his claim to fame is during this time period of the Directory, he's put in command of the French Revolution or the French revolutionary military because he proves himself by fighting off the pro-monarchy rebels in Paris. You remember how some people were coming into Paris and saying, we need a monarchy again? Napoleon shuts them down really by massacring them, many of them peaceful protesters. And the French army decided this guy is ruthless enough to lead us. And at a time when, as we saw, France is having just as many defeats as victories, Napoleon Bonaparte ends up actually leading the French army to really important victories in places like Italy, and even in places like, as we saw, Egypt. So what happens next? Well, we call this event the Coup of 18 Brumaire. This is still using that French revolutionary calendar. By this point, Napoleon is so popular that his brother, Lucien Bonaparte, has actually been elected to run the Congress. And one of those 5 presidents, one of the directors, the Abbé CS, he decides, well, let's shake things up a little bit. You see, it had now been 4 years under the Directory. France was broke for like 3 years now, and nothing is getting done. And so there's this tag team, again, between Napoleon's brother and one of the presidents. And what they do is they say, look, members of Congress, directors, you are all in danger. We need to take you out of Paris and bring you into a chateau, this really, kind of mansion place, bring you in, make sure we all can just get together and be safe. And everybody falls for it. They all go into that chateau. And then who comes back from war? Napoleon sweeps in and he says, hello, I'm glad you're all here. I have my military here too. I am now in charge and everybody needs to listen to me. And well, the people there in that chateau didn't really have much choice, did they? They could either give up their lives or they could say, yep, we're giving up our power to Napoleon. And so what did they do? They give up their power to Napoleon, and Napoleon Bonaparte overthrows the entire French revolutionary system without spilling a single drop of blood. Think about how significant that is for a moment. How much blood has there been in the French Revolution? The French Revolution has been characterized by French armies fighting off thousands of people from every other country in Europe. It's been characterized by killing a king. It's been characterized by massacres of the public in the town square. It's been characterized by the executions by the guillotine, 16,000 in a year. And now one person overthrows the whole system without killing anyone. That's the kind of guy Napoleon was. And it's why many French historians, when you read about him, sure, is he going to set himself up as a dictator? Absolutely. And yet he's sort of admired. Why is he admired? Well, one argument would be that maybe the French people were just exhausted. You might remember the American Revolution. You had a moment in which the Americans declare their independence. You have about 4 or 5 years of war. And then after that, American Revolution's over. America gets to run itself. Sure, there's some disagreements, but it's peaceful. At this point, the French Revolution has been going on for 10 years, twice as long, and nothing's more settled than before. In fact, France has now been through 5 different forms of government, starting with that monarchy, eventually moving into a constitutional monarchy for about 4 years. Those were the peaceful years of the French Revolution, where they had a king and a constitution. After that, we had the Reign of Terror, where there's really no law of the land, just kill your political enemies. Then we actually went to a republic, just a constitution, just the people, just 5 presidents, but it was a miserable failure. And so now the French people are going to go along with, well, we would call it an empire, a system of government focused on expansion, focused on taking colonies, and focused on putting one military leader in charge and letting the rest get sorted out. As we noticed, this will last from 1799 all the way until 1815, when Napoleon will face a big defeat and the government system will be reorganized again. Now, That's all a lot to think about. And so I'm going to give you a couple of writing prompts to help guide your thinking. Now, before I go into these writing prompts, here's what I want to say. You have access to these slides. You have access to all of our materials from the past few days, including the rules of the game we played last block day, including the pictures and documents from last Friday, including the escape room on Louis XVI, and now these slides. And so you're going to pick one of these writing prompts. And my goal for you is to really write a solid paragraph in which you summarize all of this great stuff you've been learning about the French Revolution. It's going to be tough. And so I want you to use your resources. I want you to go slow. And I want you to really give me a good paragraph. This is going to go into the gradebook as a formative grade, but I'm going to be giving you feedback. I'm going to be telling you where your writing is strong and where your writing can improve. You should probably shoot for at least 5 or 6 sentences. You've got less than that, you probably just don't have enough detail. Detail is what we need in historical writing. Specifics. Give me dates, give me names, give me vocab, give me examples. And you have a choice. You can talk about either of these 2 writing prompts, whichever you think you can give me more specifics on. So the first prompt, which of the ideals of liberalism, remember those, I've said those a lot today, freedom, equality, democracy, if any, did the French Revolution accomplish? Think about how the story ends with Napoleon in charge and the people kind of just going along with it. Which of the ideals of liberalism did we actually accomplish in the end? Secondly, your other option, how was life in France similar and different after the revolution compared to before it started? Think about the game we played last week. What was life in France like then? Now think about the end of the revolution. What was life in France like now? Maybe you want to answer the question, was it better or was it worse? How was it similar or different? You have a lot of resources here, and I'm going to give you one more resource. If you've got a question about the French Revolution, sure, you could go to the internet and search it up and see if you can find something, but I'm going to give you something even better. You can send me an email and I will answer the question about the French Revolution you have to the best of my ability. And that will give you one more specific detail to help you with your writing prompt. These are due tonight, so you need to get a good start on this now, probably do a little bit more of it for homework. And then once I'm back in the classroom, I can give you that feedback. We can work through it more together. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about the French Revolution. I know it's one of my favorite periods of history because it's so interesting how it contrasts with its goals, with its ideals, with what they started out with, and even with things we're more familiar with, like maybe the American Revolution. So I hope you've enjoyed it as well, and I hope you have a really great rest of your day. Thanks so much. See you later.